The Uinta Mountains stretch across northeastern Utah like a long, silent spine. Most people drive past them without ever knowing what lies deeper in the valleys, beyond the paved roads, beyond the campsites and ranger stations. Once you leave the highway, the terrain changes quickly. Asphalt becomes gravel. Gravel becomes dirt. Eventually, even the dirt disappears. And then there is only forest. In late September of 2003, I was assigned to a small wildlife monitoring station just north of the Uinta Divide. My job was simple. I was tracking elk migration patterns for a university project. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. The station itself was little more than a metal cabin anchored to a rocky clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines. The nearest town, Manila, Utah, was nearly 40 miles away. There was no phone signal, no neighbors, just a generator, a radio transmitter, and miles of empty wilderness. The first week passed quietly. Each morning, I followed the same routine. Check the motion cameras, log the temperature, refill the generator fuel. At night, I sat on the cabin steps with a notebook and watched the ridgeline disappear into darkness. The mountains were quiet in a way most people have never experienced. No traffic, no distant city noise, just wind through the pines, and occasionally the distant call of elk. But sometime during the second week, I began noticing something strange. Not something dramatic, just wrong. The forest felt quieter. Too quiet. Animals that should have been active around dusk, deer, foxes, even birds, seemed to vanish from the area near the station. At first, I assumed the migration had simply moved north earlier than expected. But when I checked the cameras, something didn't make sense. They had stopped recording movement entirely. For 3 nights in a row. Nothing. Not a single animal. That had never happened before. Still, I didn't think much of it. Until the lights appeared. The first light appeared on a Wednesday night. I remember the exact moment because I had just finished logging the weather report. Wind speed minimal. Temperature 36 degrees. Cloud cover partial. At 9:17 p.m., I stepped outside to check the generator. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a satellite, a small white point moving slowly across the sky. But satellites move in straight lines. This one didn't. It stopped, completely still, right above the ridgeline. I remember standing there, staring upward, waiting for it to move again. It didn't. For nearly 3 minutes, it remained frozen in the sky. Then it moved again, not gradually, instantly. It shot sideways across the horizon faster than anything I had ever seen. And then it stopped again, perfectly still. The motion felt unnatural, like watching a video skip frames. I went inside and checked the radar weather receiver connected to the station. Nothing unusual. No aircraft signals. No weather interference. But when I tried to transmit a routine check-in to the university base station, the radio responded with something strange. Static. Not ordinary static. It sounded layered, almost rhythmic. A faint pulsing beneath the noise, like distant machinery. The signal lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then it vanished. The radio returned to normal. I told myself it was atmospheric interference, solar activity, anything. But later that night something else happened. Around 2 a.m. I woke up suddenly. Not from a sound. From silence. The generator outside had shut off, which should have been impossible. The tank was still half full. When I stepped outside to restart it, the air felt different. Heavier. Colder. And the forest was completely still. No insects. No wind. Nothing. That's when I saw the light again. Only this time it was much closer. Over the next 3 nights, the lights returned. Not always the same one. Sometimes 2. Sometimes 3. Always silent. Always hovering above the ridgeline just west of the station. I began documenting everything. Timestamps. Angles. Movement patterns. The behavior made no sense. They would drift slowly for several minutes, then accelerate instantly, stopping again without deceleration. Physics didn't seem to apply. On the fourth night, I contacted the local ranger station using the emergency channel. A ranger named Carl responded. He listened quietly as I described the lights. Then he said something unexpected. "You're not the first to report them." He told me hikers had occasionally reported strange aerial lights in the area for years, usually dismissed as satellites or military exercises. But there was one detail that caught my attention: animals disappearing. Carl said ranchers south of the mountains had reported missing cattle several times in the past decade. No tracks, no remains, just gone. We both laughed it off. But the following night something happened that neither of us could explain. At 11:42 p.m., every electronic device in the station shut off simultaneously. The generator was still running, but the lights inside the cabin died. The computer screen went black. Even my wristwatch stopped. Outside, a faint humming sound began to fill the air. Low, almost below hearing, but strong enough that I could feel it vibrating through the cabin walls. The radio suddenly activated by itself, not transmitting, receiving. The speakers filled with distorted tones. Not static, not language, just a series of rising and falling pulses. And then came the smell, a metallic scent, sharp, like heated copper. That's when the pressure started. It felt like the air inside the cabin was becoming heavier. My ears popped, my chest tightened, and outside, the humming grew louder. Something was directly above the station. I knew it before I even stepped outside. When I opened the cabin door, the forest looked wrong. The trees were illuminated by a pale gray light. Not bright, but unnatural, like moonlight filtered through fog. Except the sky was completely clear. I stepped into the clearing and slowly looked upward. At first I couldn't see anything, just the faint glow spreading across the treetops. Then something shifted. The sky above the station seemed to bend. Not physically, visually, like heat distortion rising from asphalt. Except it was massive, and directly overhead. Then I saw its outline, only for a second, a shape darker than the night around it. Impossible to judge its size, but it blocked the stars. The humming intensified. My entire body vibrated with it. I remember the smell growing stronger. Burnt metal, ozone, and something else. Something chemical. The air pressure continued rising. My ears rang. The trees around the clearing began swaying even though there was no wind. And then the object moved. Not forward, not upward. It simply shifted, like it had always been somewhere else and reality had just caught up. Suddenly, it was no longer above me. It was several hundred yards away, hovering silently above the forest. The humming stopped instantly. Complete silence returned. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a beam of pale white light descended from the object into the trees. Not like a spotlight, more like a column. Solid, perfectly vertical. The forest beneath it vanished into brightness. I remember hearing something then. A sound from inside the trees. Not an animal, not mechanical. More like pressure being released. A deep cracking noise. Branches snapping. Then the beam vanished. The object remained motionless for a few seconds longer. And then it left. No acceleration. No sound. One moment it was there. The next moment it was gone. The stars reappeared, and the mountains returned to darkness. I stood in the clearing for a long time, listening, waiting, but the forest remained silent. Until morning. The following day I hiked toward the area where the light had touched the forest. It took nearly an hour to reach it. At first everything looked normal. Then I noticed the ground. A circular patch of earth nearly 30 feet wide had been flattened. Grass pressed completely flat against the soil, as if enormous weight had rested there. But there were no tracks, no burn marks, just crushed vegetation. And something else. The trees around the circle leaned outward slightly, as if pushed away from the center. Several branches had snapped cleanly, but not downward, upward, like something had pulled them. In the center of the clearing, I found something disturbing. A dead elk. It lay on its side with no visible wounds. No blood, but its body looked wrong, collapsed, like the bones inside had lost their structure. I returned to the station immediately and reported everything to the ranger station. 2 days later, 3 black SUVs arrived. No markings. 4 men stepped out. None of them introduced themselves. They asked questions, detailed questions, about the lights, about the radio interference, about the dead elk. They photographed the clearing, collected soil samples, removed the carcass. Before leaving, one of them said something strange. "You didn't see anything that requires reporting." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. 2 weeks later, my research project was terminated. The university cited equipment failure. The monitoring station was closed permanently, and within a month, the entire area around the site had been restricted from public access. No explanation given. It has been over 20 years since that night. I have tried many times to explain what I saw. Weather phenomena, experimental aircraft, optical illusions. But none of those explanations account for the details. The electronics failure, the pressure, the animal, or the object's movement. Several years after the incident, I returned to the area. The road leading to the old station had been blocked. A metal gate stood where the dirt road once continued into the forest. Warning signs marked the boundary. Federal land. No trespassing. But something else caught my attention. New structures had been built along the ridgeline. Small towers, each one equipped with large radar arrays, pointing toward the sky. I spoke with a rancher in Manila while I was there, an older man who had lived in the valley his entire life. When I mentioned the lights, he became quiet. Then he told me something unsettling. He had seen them too, many times, but not recently. They used to come every fall, he said, right when the elk started moving. I asked him when the last sighting had been. He thought about it for a long time before answering. About 20 years ago, the same year my station was shut down. Before I left town, he added one more detail, something I have never been able to forget. He said the animals had started disappearing again. Not cattle this time. Wildlife. Deer, elk, even birds. And always from the same direction. The mountains. I checked satellite maps when I got home. The restricted area around the old station had expanded significantly, nearly 20 square miles now. Inside that zone, there were several structures that hadn't existed before, large ones, and something else, a clearing in the forest, perfectly circular, almost identical to the one I saw that morning after the encounter, but much larger, nearly 200 feet across. No official records mention its construction. No satellite images exist from before it appeared. And the strangest part? Every satellite photo taken of that location after sunset shows something unusual in the sky above it. A faint distortion, almost invisible, like heat rising from pavement, or something large, waiting just above the trees, something that never fully left.